A Tuesday evening in August. For millions, it's a time to unwind, to shake off the day. For Karina Vetrano, it was time for her run. A simple, healthy act. A personal ritual. But on August 2nd, 2016, in the marshy parklands of Howard Beach, Queens, that routine would become a death sentence. This is Karina Vetrano's deadly jog. What went so tragically wrong on a path she knew by heart? Karina was 30 years old, a speech pathologist who spent her days helping children find their voices. She was vibrant, strong-willed, and deeply connected to her family, still living in the Queens neighborhood she loved. Around 5 p.m., she left her home on 84th Street, dressed in running clothes, earbuds in, and headed into the green expanse of Spring Creek Park. It was a familiar route. A normal evening. But as dusk began to settle, a quiet dread crept into her family's home. Karina was never gone this long. Her father, Philip, a retired firefighter, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the summer air. He went looking for his daughter. What he found, just after 11 p.m., in tall grass about 15 feet off the jogging trail, was a parent's unspeakable nightmare. Karina was face down. Her body showed the signs of a brutal, desperate struggle. Her running clothes were in disarray. She had been strangled. This wasn't an accident or a medical event. This was a violent, intimate killing in a public space. So, what happened in the space between her leaving her house and her father finding her? How does a life dedicated to communication and care end in such silent, savage violence? The scene told a story of terror. Broken teeth, scrapes and bruises, defensive wounds on her hands and arms. She had fought back with everything she had against an attacker who overpowered her. Her cell phone was found discarded nearby. The park, a place for peace and exercise, had been transformed into a hunting ground. The immediate question for the NYPD was terrifying in its simplicity. Who? There was no obvious suspect. No known conflicts. Karina Vetrano appeared to be the victim of a random, opportunistic attack. The kind of crime that sends a wave of fear through an entire community because it suggests no one is safe. At any time, even in broad daylight, as detectives descended on Spring Creek Park, they were looking for a ghost. A killer who had emerged from the reeds, attacked, and vanished back into the city's endless anonymity. They had one powerful tool, DNA evidence collected from Karina's body. But a genetic profile is just a biological blueprint without a name. The hunt was on for a match. And for the next 6 months, as a family grieved and a community looked over its shoulder, that silent, microscopic clue was the only thread leading out of the darkness. Would it be enough to find the man who ended Karina Vetrano's run forever? To understand the sheer devastation of her loss, you have to mute the horror of that marshy field and listen to the sound of Karina Vetrano's life when it was still being lived. What world did this killer invade? And what happens when a person who built her life on giving voice to others is violently silenced? Before we continue, this channel is dedicated to telling real crime stories with care and respect. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, please subscribe, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Karina Vetrano wasn't just a jogger. She was a force. At 30, she was a certified speech-language pathologist, a profession that requires equal parts intellect, patience, and deep empathy. Her days were spent in schools and clinics, helping children navigate the complexities of communication. She gave kids the tools to express themselves, to be heard. Think about that for a moment. Her life's work was literally about connection. So how does someone who dedicated herself to connecting others end up dying in brutal isolation? But her world wasn't only defined by her career. Friends and family described her with words like vivacious, fearless, and full of light. She lived at home in Howard Beach with her parents, sharing an intensely close bond with her father, Phil. She worked part-time at a local bar, not because she had to, but because she loved the social pulse of it. Her life was a rich tapestry of purpose, family, and community. Which makes you wonder, did her killer see any of that? Or did he just see a woman alone, a target of opportunity? This context is what turns a random crime into a profound tragedy. Karina's evening jog wasn't an act of naivete. It was an act of normalcy. It was part of the rhythm of a healthy, active life. The path through Spring Creek Park was her backyard track. She knew it. She trusted it. And that's the terrifying pivot. The places we feel safest are often the most unguarded. Her strength and familiarity with the route were no match for a predator who didn't see a person with a future, but an object for his rage. So, we're left with a haunting disconnect. On one side, a life packed with meaning, relationships, and future plans. On the other, a violent end that seems to acknowledge none of it. This begs a disturbing question. If the attack was as random as it appeared, was Karina simply in the wrong place at the absolute worst time? Or was there something about her determination, her visible strength, that actually triggered the violence? As her family plunged into grief, the NYPD faced a case with a victim, but no villain. They had the what and the where, but the who was a ghost. The only witnesses were the silent ones. The strands of DNA clutched under Karina's fingernails, the biological traces of a struggle left on her skin and her phone. For the detectives, the case now became a race between two clocks. The slow, meticulous clock of forensic science, and the urgent, ticking clock of a killer who was still out there, potentially plotting his next move. Could they build a man from a molecule before he struck again? The crime scene was both stark and frustratingly empty. Spring Creek Park offered a grim backdrop, marshy, isolated in parts, with tall grasses that could conceal a struggle just feet from a path. But it offered no witnesses, no clear motive, and no suspect fleeing the scene. For the NYPD, the investigation into Karina Vetrano's murder immediately hit a wall of silence. How do you find a ghost? And what does a killer do in the 6 months he remains free, believing he's gotten away with murder? The evidence pointed to a sudden, explosive attack. The medical examiner confirmed death by strangulation. But the details told a deeper story. Broken teeth, defensive wounds on her arms and hands. Karina had fought with everything she had. She had scratched, clawed, and resisted in a ferocious fight for her life. This wasn't a quick, silent ambush. It was a prolonged, brutal struggle. So why did no one hear it? And what kind of person engages in such a violent, intimate battle with a complete stranger? The profile that emerged was chilling in its randomness. This wasn't a stalker who knew her routine. This was likely an opportunistic predator, someone who saw a woman alone, a target of convenience, and acted on a violent impulse. But that theory created more fear than clarity. If it was truly random, then the killer wasn't tied to Karina. He was tied to the place, or to an urge that could strike again anywhere. This meant every runner, every woman walking alone, was now potentially in the crosshairs of a man still at large. For 6 agonizing months, that fear hung over Howard Beach and beyond. The NYPD launched a massive DNA dragnet, collecting voluntary samples from hundreds of men in the area. They released a sketch of a person of interest, a generic image that led to tips but no breakthroughs. The case grew cold in the public eye, but not for the detectives or for Karina's family. Her father, Phil, became a relentless public advocate, pleading for answers, keeping the media spotlight burning hot on a case that was going icy cold. This leads to a pressing, psychological question. What was the killer doing during those 6 months? Was he living in fear, checking the news every day, waiting for a knock on the door? Or was he living normally, his violence a secret compartment in a seemingly ordinary life? The silence was a torture for the Vetranos, but it was also a potential weapon. Every day that passed might make the killer feel more secure, more likely to slip up. The key, everyone knew, was in the DNA. Science had given them a perfect genetic fingerprint of the attacker from the evidence under Karina's nails and on her body. But a fingerprint is useless without a hand to match it to. They had the lock, but no key. The investigation became a high-stakes waiting game, praying for a match to pop in a law enforcement database or for the right tip to finally connect a name to that biological blueprint. Then, in February 2017, the silence shattered. A match was found, but it didn't come from the local dragnet or a routine arrest. It came from a seemingly unrelated source. The break in the case would introduce a name, Chanel Lewis, and it would reveal a shocking, simple truth about how a killer can hide in plain sight, and how the very science he left behind would become his undoing. For 180 days, the genetic profile of Karina Vetrano's killer existed in a void, a precise digital ghost in a law enforcement database with no name, no face, and no past. How do you hunt a man when all you have is his biological signature? The NYPD's answer was an unprecedented and controversial DNA dragnet, asking hundreds of local men to voluntarily submit cheek swabs. But was the killer even from Howard Beach? Or was he watching the frantic search from a distance, confident he was beyond their reach? The breakthrough, when it came, arrived not from the voluntary swabs in Queens, but from a routine police procedure in a different part of Brooklyn. In early 2017, Chanel Lewis, a 20-year-old from East New York, was stopped by police for riding his bicycle on the sidewalk. The interaction escalated, leading to his arrest on a minor charge. As per procedure, his DNA was taken and entered into the city's database. The match was immediate and undeniable. Lewis's DNA profile was the one they had been searching for. It matched the evidence found under Karina's fingernails, on her neck, and on her cell phone. The ghost now had a name and a face. On February 4th, 2017, police arrested Chanel Lewis for the murder of Karina Vetrano. But who was he? And what could possibly connect a quiet young man from another borough to such a brutal, random attack in a park he had no known link to? On April 23, 2019, Chanel Lewis stood once more before a judge for sentencing. The legal battle was over. The DNA evidence and the guilty verdict had sealed his fate. The only remaining question was what the court would say about the value of the life he had taken, and what lasting mark this tragedy would leave on the world Karina Vetrano was forced to leave behind. The sentence was the maximum possible, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge condemned the utter brutality of the crime, a violence so extreme it shocked the conscience. Lewis continued to maintain his innocence, his defense arguing the confession was coerced and the DNA transfer could have been accidental, claims the judge and appellate courts have consistently rejected. For the legal record, the case was closed. But does a life sentence for a random, senseless murder feel like justice, or just a permanent monument to a failure that can never be fixed? Karina's father, Philip Vetrano, addressed the court. He didn't speak of revenge. He spoke of loss. He described the void in his home, the empty chair at the dinner table, the silencing of a laughter that once filled the halls. His words framed the true cost of the crime, not just a murder, but the theft of a future of marriages, children, careers, and all the ordinary joys his daughter was robbed of. The sentence promised Lewis would never harm anyone else, but it could not return what was taken. So, what is the legacy of a life ended so violently? In the years that followed, Karina's family channeled their grief into advocacy. They pushed for the use of forensic genetic genealogy, the very kind of DNA technology that could have solved the case faster. They became a voice for other families of the lost. Their mission was to ensure some meaning could be forged from the meaningless. And then, in 2024, the city itself made a permanent statement. At a corner in Howard Beach, not far from the path she once ran, the community gathered. A new street sign was unveiled. Karina Vetrano Way. It is more than a memorial. It is a reclaiming of space. The park where she was killed will always hold a shadow, but this street corner now holds her light. It ensures that in her neighborhood, she is remembered not for how she died, but for how she lived, a vibrant, caring force who belonged there. The title of this story asked, Karina Vetrano's Deadly Jog. What went tragically wrong? The tragic answer is both simple and infinitely complex. What went wrong was a random encounter with a predator. A routine act of health met a vortex of senseless violence. The justice system responded with a punishment that lasts a lifetime. But her community responded with something more enduring, a legacy. Her name on a street sign is a promise to remember her joy, not just her end, and a reminder that while violence can invade any space, so too can love, memory, and a refusal to let darkness have the final word. The evidence against Lewis was formidable, but largely circumstantial, except for that DNA. There were no witnesses placing him at the park. No history of violence. The prosecution's case rested on the science, and on a powerful, damning piece of evidence they obtained after his arrest. A videotaped confession. In that recording, Lewis told detectives a disturbing story. He described being in the park that day, feeling angry and frustrated over loud music and family conflicts. He said he saw Karina Vetrano jogging. He claimed she said something to him, a detail fiercely contested by the prosecution, who argued it was an invention. He then described attacking her, beating her, and strangling her. His own words, calm and detailed, painted a picture of a random, impulsive explosion of violence. This confession became the center of the legal storm. The defense would later argue it was coerced, the product of a lengthy interrogation of a suggestible young man. But in that moment, it seemed to provide the why that had eluded everyone. A deadly collision of one person's inner rage with another person's innocent presence. It framed the murder not as a premeditated act, but as a catastrophic, spontaneous crime of opportunity. Yet, a confession can be contested. DNA cannot. The two trials of Chanel Lewis would become a battle between these two pillars of evidence. The first trial in November 2018 ended with a hung jury, deadlocked on his guilt. Some jurors reportedly questioned the confession's validity, but the DNA evidence remained an unshakable truth. In the retrial in the spring of 2019, the prosecution focused relentlessly on that scientific fact. After just 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts, including murder and sexual abuse. The legal system had reached its conclusion. But for a community and a family, a verdict is not an explanation. It doesn't answer the deepest, most haunting question. Why did this man on that day choose to end her life? With a life sentence now inevitable, the court would have one final chance to provide a measure of answer, not about the killer's motive, but about the value of the life he took. What does justice look like for a life so full, stolen so randomly? Thank you for watching.